Good evening and welcome to the next installment of Meet the Leaders. I am your host, Jerry McPherson, Director of Economic Empowerment for the Greater Phoenix Urban League. If you are new to the program, we got a little bit of housekeeping that we need each of you to participate in. If you're a regular to the broadcast, You know what I'm about to say. Please like, comment, share. Let the world know that you're with us. We want to get as many people to this broadcast as possible. And the best way for that to happen is if you communicate that this broadcast is happening right now with your network. We greatly appreciate you sharing your time, energy, and expertise with us today. The program, as you can see, is Arizona Deliver the Freedom to Vote Act. With the Martin Luther King Jr. weekend quickly approaching, there are a number of activations happening around the city and around the country for that matter, not only to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also to bring additional attention to voting acts that are currently being stalled in Congress. So again, before we continue, please like, comment, share. Let the world know that you're with us. We want to get as many people to this broadcast as possible. We'll be discussing the Freedom to Vote Act with a couple of panelists. The first of which will include Alex Galata, the Arizona State Director for All Voting is Local, along with Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, the National Spokesperson for Just Democracy. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce the President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Urban League, President George Dean. Take it away, George.
Thank you, Jerry, and Happy New Year to all of our listeners and viewers out there and so forth. Welcome to 2022. This has been our first edition of the Meet the Leaders, and let's hope that 2022, in fact, I have made a resolution that I'm going to do everything I can to make 2022 better than 2021. And one of the things that we're going to take care of is this subject that we have tonight, and that's voting and the voting rights bills and so forth that are in our nation right now. In fact, in 2021, 440 bills to restrict voting access was introduced in 49 different states. 19 states passed 34 new laws making it more difficult to vote, and there have been no cases cited demonstrating evidence of any widespread voter fraud. But the main focus, especially of the Trump Republicans, is on unproven claims of fraud as they question the legitimacy of the 2020 election, a year away from congressional midterms. And with clear indications that Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, and Kristen Sinema, a Democrat from our own state here in Arizona, are against changing the filibuster rules in the U.S. Senate, a big battle over the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 is ahead in early 2022. So we're going to talk about all of this tonight, and I'm going to do everything that I can to get you to understand the urgency of the fact that we need to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 passed, and we need to do it quickly as possible. I think that, personally think that our democracy is at stake, not only for voting rights, but the whole idea and issue of democracy is a part of it all. I'm very thankful, and I want to give thanks right now to Alex Galata, the Arizona State Director for All Voting is Local, and Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, the National Spokesperson for Just Democracy, that has agreed to appear on this panel and meet the leaders with us tonight. And with that, I will turn it back to Jerry so we can get started on this very important topic.
Thank you once again, President Dean. And as per usual, want to say thank you on behalf of the Greater Phoenix community for your leadership of our Urban League affiliate over the last 30 years and the 50 years serving the Urban League movement nationwide. So we thank you for your service to the movement. I would like to first introduce Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, the National Spokesperson for Just Democracy. Stephanie, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jerry, and blessings to you, President Dean, and all of the listeners. Happy New Year as well. I am Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, by profession, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church for the past 7 years, also in Colorado Springs, also professor of Women's and Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and interim chief diversity officer for the University of Colorado Springs, and spokesperson for Just Democracy, which is a coalition of 40 plus Black and Brown organizing communities that do work on the ground to really do democracy reform and to protect our democracy. As President Dean mentioned, our democracy is on the line right now. And if we don't do very structural, deep work to protect our democracy, then we will have to figure out what comes next. So thank you all for having us in this conversation around protecting voting, the freedom to vote. And it's just a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Stephanie. We greatly appreciate you sharing your time with us, and we are excited to have this conversation, this very much needed conversation with our community. Next, I would like to introduce Alex Galata, Arizona State Director for All Voting is Local. Alex, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jerry, and President Dean, Reverend Spalding. It's a pleasure being here. I'm a civil rights advocate. I've been a poverty lawyer my entire life. About 4 or 5 years ago, I started doing some voting rights work and really enjoy the ability to really talk about how voting rights really link to basic human rights issues. You know, if we can't elect people that reflect the communities that are being served, we can't have a democracy that supports the people in our community. And that's really what we need to be working for. And I think this federal legislation, and I'll talk some about state legislation, are ways that we can make a difference. All Voting is Local is a group, is an organization that does voting rights advocacy around the country. We have people in 8 states right now. One of them is Arizona. And really what we focus on is the nuts and bolts of election administration to make sure that polling places are located in communities where the people are and are accessible, to make sure that the rules about how you vote and how you're treated when you go to a polling place, about how the poll workers are trained, and all of the other mechanics about how the voting happens in a way that's fair and equitable and increases access to voting rather than decreases access to voting. And so we're very invested in making the system work better. And what Congress is considering in terms of both the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act really just create bare minimum procedures to make sure that voting works well in every state. And whatever happens with those bills, we're going to make sure that we're fighting to make sure that voting happens well in Arizona. So I also am pleased to be here tonight and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you once again, Alex. And you touched on something that we want to make sure that we communicate to the audience throughout the program. You know, there is like this right or this fight for voting rights is happening on a federal level as well as a local level. So if you are in Arizona, this program is definitely for you. But if you're tuning in from anywhere around the country, there's going to be content that will be vital and important to you, and information that you can take back to your own communities to try to activate those citizens to make sure that the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill are passed into law and our voting rights are protected. So thank each of you, and we're really excited to get into the program. So Alex, let's start with you. If you can tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing over the past year surrounding voting rights.
Well, I would, we're at a bad time, right? It's just, there's no two way about it, right? Like they're a faction of people, they're a noisy minority, but they actually have a lot of power in a lot of state legislatures around the country. And they're people who believe in authoritarianism over freedom. There are people who believe in lies and conspiracy theories over facts and data and science. And there are people who believe in political power and greed over justice and fairness, right? And we have to just recognize that that's what we're up against and that's who we're fighting. And these folks, which, have There's a lot of white supremacy behind them, a lot of white supremacist energy behind them, and they really want to target communities of color, Black, Latino, Native American communities, other communities that increasingly are having their voices heard for a first time in some circumstances, and they want to make it harder to vote. And they're trying to make it harder to vote in two ways. One is through these kinds of bills that purge voter rolls, that outlaw drop boxes, that restrict early voting, that do things to make it harder to vote, and then more troubling, these things that they're doing to use political power to basically overrule the results, taking over boards of elections in Georgia, questioning results that they don't like in Arizona with the sham election review, and other things like that. And so, it's a big fight. We have to remember we're not powerless, and there are a bunch of ways we can fight back. And, I think I'll stop there. We can talk more about the ways we can fight back. But the federal bills are one of them, but there's a lot we can do at the state level besides.
Stephanie, and to be clear, we are all friends here, so we are using first names on today's broadcast, just to be clear. All respect due to all of our panelists on the program today. But Stephanie, if you can tell us a little bit about the work that your organization has been doing over the past year or so regarding voting rights.
Absolutely. So again, as I mentioned, Just Democracy is a coalition of 40 plus Black and Brown led grassroots organizations across the country. And each of those organizations, when we came together, may have had their own particular localized interest in how they were responding to harm being done in their communities, whether that's around Black women's health or gun violence prevention or housing equity. All of those different things are some of the things that our organizations organize around locally. But what we recognize is that every piece, as Alex pointed out, everything that impacts our lives on a local level is either hindered or expanded by what is going on federally. And for us, we understood that if we don't reform basic foundational democracy work, then what we want to accomplish and achieve in our local space is going to be prohibited. So when we think about the Freedom to Vote Act and delivering and protecting voting rights across the country, we have been really working to abolish the filibuster, because you can't pass legislation in Congress without having both the House and the Senate on board. And when the Senate is pretty much yielding to a racist structure in terms of playing games with what the rules are that are not necessarily required by the Constitution, when we know it's rooted in white supremacist ideology, when we cannot get legislation passed through the Senate because of the filibuster, then we have to make sure that filibuster reform or abolition takes place before we can even try to get legislation that the House has been passing to be passed in the Senate. So we've been working collectively to abolish the filibuster. We've been working with some of our partners in Arizona to hone in the conversation with Senator Sinema, because we know that she, along with Joe Manchin, are one of the biggest Democratic holdups to the abolishing of the filibuster and getting legislation passed in our country. So in October, we partnered and organized on some actions there. And then this coming weekend, MLK Observation Weekend, actual birthday, we are doing some actions locally, again, with our partner organizations on the ground who have taken the lead and really want to speak to the president and speak to senators in Arizona and let them know that if you can deliver on bridges, you have done that, you have passed this infrastructure bill when the full weight of the presidency is behind you, when the Senate wants to get legislation passed, if you can deliver on bridges, then you can deliver on voting rights. So there are actions taking place, again, like I said, this weekend with local partners there in Arizona.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephanie. I actually want to pause for a moment because I think it'd be a great opportunity to make sure we are educating our audience before we kind of dive into the conversation deeply. So I'll ask two questions, and Stephanie, I'll give you the first chance to answer the first one, and then Alex, if you may take the other one. So, firstly, the first question is defining what a filibuster is, and then secondly, the second question, if someone would be inclined to kind of tell us the difference between the two bills that were mentioned on the program so far: the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill.
Absolutely. So the filibuster is an obscure, originated as an obscure rule that the Senate could utilize, or senators could utilize to keep a vote from taking place in the Senate. And I say that in just the basic, most common way to prevent a piece of legislation from ever having a vote, because one would get up and just run the clock on and on and on talking. We've seen that historically. We haven't really seen it done in modern manifestations. But what it grew into is, because there's a way to block having a vote on a piece of legislation, that if the majority party in the Senate that's controlling the Senate, if they did not know that they could guarantee a majority vote, then legislation wouldn't even be brought to the floor, because they recognize that the minority party could, again, just prevent it from ever having a discussion and ever having a vote. And so they wouldn't even take the time to debate the bill. They wouldn't even take the time to ask for the senators to express what their vote is on that piece of legislation. And so we end up with a situation where in the Senate, only about 1% of the legislation that is ever crafted in a legislative session ever gets discussed and ever gets voted on in the Senate. So imagine that you go to work day after day after day, collect a check month after month after month, or week after week, however it comes, and you only do 1% of the work over the entire course of your, time there. That's essentially what's happening in the House, in the Senate right now, is that legislators, the senators, they're showing up and only really voting on 1% of the legislation that comes across their desk.
Yeah. And that's, one of the most frustrating things that, some folks who are not in politics, it's one of the discrepancies with politics is, even though the controlling party or the majority party should have the decision maker or have more influence, there's stall tactics like the filibuster that allows the minority party to delay any sort of advancement. One other thing before I give it to Alex, those in the audience, if you have a question, please drop them in the comments at any time. We will open the floor to audience questions in a moment. Alex, if you can just give us a little bit about the two different voting bills that we had outlined earlier.
Sure. The Freedom to Vote Act basically just sets really basic universal standards that need to be followed in the states, and that states can't go below. They can't make voting harder or less accessible than these basic standards. And it's to make sure that registration is used for a valid purpose and not as a barrier. Why do you have to register a month before an election? Right? So the Freedom to Vote Act includes same-day voter registration. You have to have some way, if people have the documentation they need to show that they're eligible to vote, and they walk into the polls on election day and they're in the right place, they should be able to vote. Right? It's pretty basic, right? So these aren't, sometimes this bill gets cast as like it's some sort of radical takeover or something. It's just like basic, simple voting rights. Just making sure that states that want to suppress the vote aren't allowed to do it, right? That states can't pass laws that prevent people from getting registered if they're allowed to vote. And other good, smart policy like automatic voter registration that says that when people turn 18, when people become citizens, however it is, they get to the point where they're eligible to vote, that there are places where we automatically get them registered to vote if they're eligible to vote, right? The whole purpose of registration is not to create a barrier. It's just to make sure that we validate whoever it is that's voting. And if we have a process for doing that, we should do that. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act basically restores the Voting Rights Act to a place where it was before the Supreme Court gutted it in 2013. And that has a set of principles that say if a state is doing things that are discriminatory or has a history of discriminating against people in voting, we're going to look carefully before we allow them to pass new laws. And that's really what it does. It restores the Voting Rights Act to the way it was prior to 2013. It creates what's called pre-clearance, which is a system where certain changes to voting need to be looked at by the Department of Justice. You need to establish that they're not discriminatory before you can move forward with them. Like that's a pretty low standard, right? The fact that we have to fight so hard to get our basics back is the symptom of a bigger problem, and that we really need a better democracy, and a democracy that's more reflective of the people that the country is serving. And we're only going to get that, though, by these steps, right? We need to move this federal legislation. We need to start electing people in our states and create state legislatures that are more reflective of the people that live in their communities, so that we basically create a system that is more inclusive. And this is the first step. And these two acts take us back to a much better place than we're at right now.
Another term that we haven't mentioned this evening so far that is also very important in this whole fight and so forth, and that's gerrymandering. You know, we had the census in 2020, and that means that congressional districts and state, local legislative districts and so forth will be redrawn and so forth. And in those places where Republicans are in control, they also have come up with maps that's really leaving people out in terms of voting and so forth, and putting more Democrats in one district than in another district. And it's just a lot of things that goes on with that gerrymandering. You want to talk a little bit about that, Alex, and the effects that it can have in terms of voting and so forth?
Sure. I mean,
representation, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a district that's drawn like this, specifically, it's drawn like a C, a crescent moon, simply so that we can concentrate the white people's power, right? That's what it's about. It's about concentrating power, and it's primarily about racial power. It's silencing communities of color that could be electing leaders that reflect their communities, and breaking those communities up in different districts so that concentrated power, for example, in the middle of a city or some other place, can't actually be exercised by the people in that city. It gets broken off over here and over here and over there. And that's what gerrymandering is. And it creates a system where each person doesn't have a fair voice. And that, on top of these undemocratic things like the filibuster, like Dr. Spalding talked about, which allows a minority to control a minority in the Senate to basically push their will on top of a majority. All of these things are undemocratic things that we need to work on and fight against. Gerrymandering, the filibuster and the unfair impacts that has, and then what's happening in the state legislatures, I would say, is the third piece of that we need to fight back against.
George, do you have a follow-up to that, or? I did want to pause for a moment, and we have a question from the audience, which I think was a very important one that we can bring in regarding the filibuster. And Mark overall asks, is there a legal mechanism to override the filibuster, rid of mandamus compelling a vote, possibly? He's a lawyer, so he flexing his intellect. And actually, we'll go to Stephanie on this, because this will speak to some of the activations happening this weekend, and some of the past conversations with cinema in particular. So, can you speak to if there's a legal mechanism to override the filibuster? Or what is the response to it?
I'll say yes. The legal mechanism is to just have a vote that the leader of the Senate can call a vote whenever. The filibuster for many people, they imagine that it is constitutionally binding, like that it is something the Constitution makes in terms of the rules for the Senate, and it's not. Whenever the leader in power wants to call for a vote, they can call for a vote. And we've seen the rules bent. We've seen the vote called when Mitch McConnell was the leader in the Senate. Whenever they wanted to pass tax cuts for corporations, they called for a vote, and they did what they wanted to do without a super majority being in place. And that's the other piece that we have to remember, that the filibuster is not just simply, on the surface, you can say that it's really, a way to keep order, so to speak, but it's really rooted in racism. The emergence of the filibuster was to prevent the moving past Reconstruction, was to prevent Jim Crow, was to prevent from Black people from actually getting access to the ballot in this country post the Civil War. And so when we think about that, to prevent anti-lynching laws, it's still like this deeply rooted racist practice that nobody wants to like shout from the rooftop and say, why are we still yielding to this rule?
So, and there's another question in the audience that I want to get to. I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself, but one of the things that we are, as a community, that coalition has put together, is trying to get the Senate to pass legislation. Is it maybe using the wrong terminology, to do away with the filibuster, right? So, what is in the way of preventing our Congress from doing away with the filibuster?
It's just a rule. It's their own internal rule. They could change their rule. They have to agree to change their rule, and it may be that they'll find a way to like save face and say they're not doing away with the filibuster in general, but they're making an exception for voting, or they're going to require a talking filibuster, which effectively might result in these bills being able to get a vote, or a variety of other different things that they can do. And so, like, I don't even know all the like insider baseball. There are probably people that do, but I don't even bother with figuring out all the insider baseball as to how they might get this done. The word on the street is, in the next week or two, something might happen. There might be movement in the Senate. We need to keep the pressure on to make sure that whatever it is, I don't care how it happens, I want votes on these two bills, right? And I want our Senate to vote on these bills, because I think if we vote on these bills, we're going to pass these bills. And I don't care how that happens, to be quite frank. And at this point, it doesn't really matter to me. All that matters is that we get a vote on these bills and we pass them, because they're critical going into these 2022 midterm elections, that we have these protections in place, as many as possible.
And I just want to add to what Alex has said,
Please.
that calling for the vote in and of itself really puts on the record, when he says that we might get the passage of voting rights legislation, it forces someone to put on the record, a senator to put on the record that, yes, I want those who have been formerly incarcerated to have the restoration of their voting rights upon completion of their incarceration. If somebody is in a state as their senator who's like, nah, I don't want that, then those who are in communities now know for sure, regardless of what your campaign slogans might have been and what your promises are, you voted to not allow my brother, my sister, my cousin, my aunt, my mom, once they finish serving their time, to have access, to be reinstated as a full citizen of this country. You voted and said you don't want that. That does not represent me here in Illinois. That does not represent somebody in California. That does not represent somebody in Georgia. I'm not voting for you again because you are on the record saying this is not what you want.
And it's quite interesting, and I will. This will yield into another question we got from the audience that, it's the top of the year. We are entering midterm elections. This is, quite frankly, it may sound like hyperbole, but this is the most critical midterm elections of our country's history, quite frankly.
Right.
So it sounds like there may be a strategy to stall as long as possible, not get on the record with yay or nay regarding the voting rights bills until possibly after midterm elections, which is a whole year away. Which leads to the question from the audience: is why does there not seem to be a sense of urgency from community members and citizens to kind of bring this to the forefront? And to be clear, that question came from Cordero Holmes. He says he doesn't sense an urgency to act in the general public. How do we begin to mobilize the community for action so that our freedoms are not stolen away?
Absolutely, I would say that that there is some momentum happening, and that's why I encourage, if you are in Arizona, to participate in the actions that are taking place this weekend around Martin Luther King Jr. And their family, advocating for the passage of this legislation and to build with them. But for the most part, there isn't a sense of urgency because the average person feels like this conversation is so above their understanding, right? They hear the word filibuster and they're like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how that impacts my life. Just as someone commented earlier, they're like, I didn't know that these people are showing up day after day, collecting your taxpayer money, getting a check, and it's a nice 6-figure check, and they are collecting your money, only doing 1% of the work. If people knew that, then they would actually, mobilize around, like, how you get a check that you're not even voting on stuff. Like, I think I thought I sent you to Congress to do something, and you're not even voting on anything because the leader won't even bring it to the table.
Yeah, I would add, like, these folks aren't winning. They're only going to win if they break us down, right? If they beat us down, if we lose our heart, if we don't keep fighting, if we don't speak out, if we don't go down to the Capitol, if we don't click all those emails, if we don't continue to take action, then they will win, right? But they're not winning, right? Like, if you look at what the recent history, we're not doing too bad. We're making progress. It's not as fast as we want it to be, and we would like it to be faster. And that has a lot of people frustrated. But people shouldn't give up hope, because it isn't fast, but we're making real progress, and we can make more progress if we can turn this corner, right? Like, we're either going to turn this corner or we're not, right? If we don't turn this corner, we're going to slip into fascism in this country. There are some really bad, powerful forces who have been empowered, and for the first time in a long time, people have a real stark choice. Like, do you want to believe in people who believe in science, or people who believe in, like, Q stuff on the internet, right? Like, that's what we're up against, is people who believe in truth and untruth, and are willing to look at untruth and look you in the eye and say, I believe in untruth. Untruth is the same thing as truth, right? And that's the place we're at in our country. And I do think if we fight back against it, we can beat it back, right? But we just need to stay positive. And that's part of why I'm saying, I don't care what happens this week. I'm going to keep fighting in Arizona, because whether this bill should pass, and we should get it passed, and people should fight for it to get passed. But even if it doesn't pass, We need overwhelming turnout in November, because that can overcome a lot, right? It can't overcome everything, and we can't ask people to do that again and again and again without fixing the system. But overwhelming turnout means that, in fact, better policies get made. We win, better policies get made.
And hopefully something, Alex and Dr. Spalding, is going to happen. You know, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, did say that voting rights was going to be on the agenda in January. That's this month that we're in now. So we hope that the senator keeps his word and indeed bring that up so that the world will know, and especially the American citizens will know, who is for and who is against this whole idea of democracy being pushed aside for an autocracy, something that is taking place.
And Dr. Spalding was so right. We just, these people do not want accountability, and accountability is what you get if you force a vote, right? What the filibuster does, it lets a bunch of people not be accountable. Do you stand for voting rights or do you not? And forcing this vote over the filibuster, forcing this vote makes people take a stand. And that's what we need in this country right now. We need every politician, we need everyone in the US Senate to stand up and either say, are you for voting rights or are you against voting rights? Are you going to go with these people who believe in lies and conspiracy theories? Or are you going to believe in science and data and stand up for the people?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a bit curious. So I'm familiar with the filibuster. I've been interested in politics to some degree since high school. But I don't intend to put either of you on the spot. But can you call in recent memory of a time where the filibuster was ignored for the sake of getting legislation passed, where it was a similar contention? There was, both sides stood strongly on an opinion, but they overrode the filibuster to get the legislation passed.
The infrastructure bill is evidence of you all can come together across party lines, take a vote, and pass this piece of legislation. They do it on budget reconciliation often. Sometimes it is across party lines, but they do it on budget reconciliation.
They did it on the Supreme Court justice right before the election.
Supreme, that's right.
So to be clear, it's not unprecedented to do away with the filibuster to get legislation passed. It's curious to figure out why is it a stalwart on this particular issue. And quite frankly, we know what it is. It's the more folks that are allowed to vote, the increases the likelihood that you will lose your seat. So there is a definite need for us to start putting the pressure on our elected officials. Mm-hmm. With that being said, you both have been active in meeting with senators in Arizona and I'm assuming across the country. Dr. Spalding, can you let us know what those conversations have been like when you met with the senators in Arizona, Senator Andor Kelly, if he was party to it?
Well, you all can see the result of those conversations. As President George Dean pointed to earlier, right now, people think that they're comfortable and that they are going to win their seats, right? The polling demonstrates for them that they are secure enough to continue in the behavior that they are practicing. And so they haven't necessarily been the most receptive to adjusting their behavior to the will of the people. But Arizonans are not playing. Like your organizers are out here and they are doing the heavy lifting right now to make sure that she recognizes and that everyone recognizes that you can't always trust these polling numbers. And if you aren't willing to adapt to the people who got you in office, this is not the same person who came through the ranks in Arizona politics. She's not the same person. And so people are like, look, we elected you on this basis. You cannot keep turning a blind eye to what Black, Brown, Indigenous people are asking you to do. expecting that you will continue to keep this seat.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So again, if you are in the audience, if you do have a question, please feel free to drop it into the comments. We will make every effort to get your question asked to our panelists before the broadcast concludes. So if you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Another thing that hasn't been talked about, Jerry, is the fact that with the filibuster, getting back to that once again, that has been changed. How many times, Alex? 9 or 10 times, different times that the filibuster has changed. The rules for the filibuster has changed.
Yeah, I'm not a filibuster expert, and so I don't know the specifics, but it's changed whenever they want to change it. Okay,
Yeah.
it gets
Yeah,
changed
that's
whenever
it.
they want to change it, and for some reason they haven't thus far wanted to change it for this. We think this is important enough and it impacts communities of color enough that it needs to be changed for this. And we now expect people to stand up and be held accountable to that. Okay. And that's really what this is about. Now we have an opportunity to do something for people of color in this country by doing something about the filibuster. Right. And we want to see whether or not politicians are up for that.
Yeah, it has become a sacred cow now to some people, and the Republicans and its leadership, especially Mitch McConnell, has made it very clear that they're not going to do anything that the Democrats want, they don't want. You know, it's a no kind of thing. Like I can remember 12 years ago when he said with Obama that my job is to make sure he's a one-term president. And I mean, how can we, in good faith, just continue to carry on and let these people get away with this kind of stuff?
And I want to underscore also, because it's absolutely true that the filibuster is often used as a blockade for legislation that really touches to the heart of Black, Brown, Indigenous community members. But the way in which legislatures across the country have tried to gut voting rights, and Alex can speak to this, it's not just about people of color, right? White people in America need to recognize that they coming for you and your access to the ballot as well. For those who are elderly, for those who are disabled, for those who are impoverished, what has happened in this last year is impacting white folks' access to the ballot. So it's not just about like, okay, I'll do this because I got a Black friend. No, this is about democracy in general. And these Republicans want an autocrat. They want like singular fascist control, and they are willing to sacrifice everyone in order to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in Arizona, and this is across the country, there are bills that basically said the state legislature gets to decide who the president will be, not the people, not the people, not the votes of the people, but that the state legislature should come in after an election and they decide. Okay, it just was, we can overrule the will of the people if we don't like the will of the people. Right? Very anti-democratic, autocratic. It's like, it's bad for us and it's bad for our country to have people like that in control. And that's really what they're about. They just want to be in power, and they're willing to hurt their own people. They're willing to hurt poor people. They're willing to hurt white people. They're willing to hurt people of color. They are doing everything they can do to stay in power, and they don't care who they hurt. And they don't care what the truth is. They don't care about any of these basic norms that we've held for a long time. It's power over everything else. And those are not the kind of people any of us want, white or Black, running our country. And that's where they're gone, right? They've gone to that end, and people need to make a choice, right? And they're, white people and communities of color are going to have to make a choice. Are those the people you want like making decisions for you? Are those the people you want in charge of your school board? Are those the people you want in charge of your democracy? And I think the answer from a great majority of people is going to be no, if we can allow them to have that say.
Yeah. Alex, if we can stay with you for a little bit longer, I think it was a great opportunity to pivot and talk about the voting landscape locally. So if you can share just some of the work that, or some of the issues that has happened underneath our noses, quite frankly, over the past couple of months, as it pertains to voting rights in Arizona.
Sure, and not just Arizona. I mean, like the make it harder to vote, right? Like Arizona, we were lucky in that we had a bunch of different bills and only a couple got through, right? Whereas like in Florida and in Georgia and in some other places, they had these gigantic bills that had 100 provisions, and they passed that bill in Georgia and they passed that bill in Florida. And so people in Georgia and Florida are going to have a harder time voting. You know, they're limiting drop boxes. They're making it harder to do early voting. They're trying to outlaw voting on Sunday. Who does that hurt? That hurts souls to the polls. It's just like it's painfully obvious. Why are we doing that? We want to suppress voters of color. We want to like limit one of the most powerful ways that voters of color have organized together to come together to vote is souls to the polls. Very powerful, very impactful process whereby communities and congregations get together and vote together, and that those things are designed to prevent that or to limit it or to restrict it. And they're being passed, right? They were passed in Georgia. They were passed in Florida. Most of those things didn't make it through in Arizona because we have a legislature that is almost evenly divided, and it just takes one reasonable person on any bill to be able to stop it. And we've been lucky. We've stopped a lot of bills in Arizona. And I'm hopeful this session we're going to stop a lot more bills in Arizona too. But that doesn't help the people in Georgia, and it doesn't help the people in Florida. And that's why we need these federal bills passed, right? Is they stop those things. Even when a bad bill is passed, it's one step. It's got to be implemented. A lot of what I do every day is figuring out how these bills are going to be implemented, right? If there can only be 10 drop boxes, then I'm going to fight for where those 10 drop boxes should be and what communities they should be made accessible to. If we're going to limit early voting, then we're going to fight about where that early voting is going to be and what communities need it and how we're going to get access to it, right? And so like every one of these bad bills has to be implemented, and there's 1,000 different ways that election officials need to make and exercise discretion in implementing the law. And we need to be there in the room when they're making those choices. And so we've got to be fighting for local election policy and local election leaders. We got to get great people to run to be election officials instead of all these stop the steal. Right now, there was an article today about how stop the steal people around the country are trying to take over election boards and trying to take over election offices around the county. Well, guess what? There's more of us than there are of them. We need to get people like us to be running for those boards. We need to get people like everyone on this call running for those boards, and everyone listening on this call to say, like, I'm going to put myself in that place and I'm going to help be the solution and not the problem.
That's good.
Absolutely. I actually appreciate all of that.
I second that motion.
And to the point, Alex, if you have this smaller group, but they're louder, they're active, they're more willing to go out there and run office and hold office and put themselves out in the forefront, they're going to get what they want. And we need, whether it's if it's specific to a party, or those folks who just have more rational minds and believe in equality, to be frank, those folks need to step up and get some of these influential positions.
Can I just share?
Yes,
I know I mentioned it several times before about some actions that are taking place in Arizona. If you are in Phoenix, near Phoenix on this Saturday, those who are willing to participate in the actions where the King family will be present, please join us at near Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church, which is at near the cross streets of South 15th Street and East Jefferson Street. So if you're near there, we'll be out there at 9 a.m. On this Saturday, and there will be a pre-rally event. Then there will be a march, and then there will be a post-rally event. So please, from 9 to about 1 o'clock on Saturday, near Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church, which is South 15th Street and East Jefferson Street.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Thank you, Stephanie. You actually beat me to it. That's where I was going to pull this question up. I definitely wanted to give a chance to communicate the event from Saturday. Normally in Arizona, there is an MLK March to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This year, there's an additional activation happening on Saturday, as Stephanie just outlined. So please, if you are in the Phoenix community, we want you all to come out. Again, Saturday specific to drawing attention to the Freedom to Vote Act and encouraging our elected officials to possibly do away with the filibuster and take action on the respective acts that were outlined earlier. All right. Thank you, Lynn Cordova, for your question. If you are in the audience, any more questions, please keep them coming in. We want to get your questions answered. We are coming close to time. So, give everyone a chance to kind of share some additional thoughts while we see if there are any final questions that are coming in. Alex, Stephanie, George, anything you would like to share before we continue?
Well, if you're not in the Phoenix area, Martin Luther King III and his family members, they do have a Move On petition circulating. So you can also do that action online, right? You can sign on to that petition to be delivered to President Biden saying, like, look, we here across the country want you to move on voting and protecting voting rights. So lean into this Congress and encourage the Senate to do whatever it has to do in order to get this legislation passed.
I think I would add that we're working with a bunch of coalition partners on what's called the Democracy Pledge for Arizona, democracypledgeaz.com. And it's a coalition website of basic principles about democracy that we're asking people to say, I believe in these, and then ask their elected officials to stand up for those principles. And the beauty of that is there's a get involved page at that website that will have activations. Right now, there's an activation about asking you to to get your elected officials involved in this process. But there's also a push now to shut down public testimony by video conference at the Arizona legislature. Like last session, people were able to testify like this by Zoom. They're trying to shut it down this year. They're trying to prevent it from happening and only allow people who are willing to go in and risk their health to be able to testify. So there's a petition there on that. There will be other petitions there, and that Get Involved page will be evergreen. So we'd encourage people to go to democracypledgeaz.com if you're in Arizona and sign the pledge, and then keep bookmark that Get Involved tab, because as the legislature's happening, as we're looking for election protection volunteers throughout the year, we'll be posting things. Not just All Voting is Local, but tons of civil rights groups and activist groups will be posting activations there all year long.
I'd like to ask a question, because I don't know, and maybe what both of you know, and that is, can an executive order, a presidential executive order, do anything about the voting situation that we have now?
I will say it can't.
Got a drum roll
going. It cannot abolish the filibuster. Only the majority leader can push for the votes to be called in the Senate. So that really is like leaning into Chuck Schumer and saying, look, we want this legislation to pass. There are also limitations too, because again, states' rights versus federal rights and what an executive order can do. States have the power to determine, the federal government ensures that who has the right to vote, they have the power to determine how that looks, in their state.
Yeah, I mean, I think the president could work with the Department of Justice on voting rights enforcement. I mean, there are things the president can do, but they don't give us the real solutions that we need. We need the Senate to act. The House has already acted. We need the Senate to act and to at least make every person stand up and be counted.
Okay.
Absolutely. So again, I encourage, like, I know we say it every election cycle, but this really is one of the most important midterm elections ever. And because we could essentially, and when I say we, I am speaking, Democrats could essentially lose the Senate majority that they have. So I encourage all of the listeners in your audience to talk to your community members, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors, talk to your colleagues on lunch breaks if you are around them, or when you have the opportunity on your social media, and say we cannot sit this midterm out. Participation generally drops in the midterm cycle, but we cannot sit this midterm out. We need you all to be organizing locally. I know all voting is local. That's definitely the statement. But we also need you all to get involved in Senate races across the country. You can donate, you can phone bank, you can volunteer, because so much is hybrid. We need you to be involved in Senate races across the country so that Democrats don't lose this majority. Because if they do, then we're just sitting for the next 2 years, really not doing anything. And it is like, that's the worst case scenario.
Absolutely, Stephanie. As mentioned earlier, there is a sense of urgency, and if we don't awaken to it, if we don't step up and actually start taking action, who knows? We recently just acknowledged the anniversary of the attack on the Capitol, and where it's American citizens were really trying to undo a fair election. So, and I would hate to say whether it was close or not, but that act in and of itself was unprecedented, and that was something that we all would have said 3 years ago that had never happened, right? And it happened. So who knows what the next 12 months will look like, or beyond the next 12 months, if we do not restore voting rights, if we do not take a stand and support the right for every American citizen to vote in a fair election and hold our elected officials accountable. It's not hyperbole. Like, this is the most important election of our lives, and the one after that will likely be the same. And that's just kind of how the philosophy goes. We need to take action now. We need to get activated now, and stop standing on sideline and allowing the select group of individuals, not only voters but elected officials, determine the way forward for 330 million Americans across the country. Soapbox down. Any other questions from the audience? It looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience. I'll give one last chance for closing thoughts, and then we'll start with Stephanie and then Alex, and then leave it for George to give us our closing thoughts before we conclude the program.
Again, I would just say thank you for having us in this conversation. I would encourage everyone that is listening, if you are able to participate in the actions that are happening in Phoenix on Saturday. If you're not in Phoenix, if you're in the DC area, there are actions happening on Monday with the King family. There are actions online with moveon.org. There's a way to plug in. Call your senator, even if there's no action locally happening in your space, and follow these organizations. Follow Just Democracy. Follow All Votes All Voting is Local, and really lean into who is running. Do your research and make this election cycle count, both at the local level, because we saw what is happening with state legislatures, and at the federal level. Don't think that you could sit this one out.
Okay. Thank you.
Stephanie. Alex?
Yeah, I'd say democracy is on the ballot in 2022 and don't be on the sidelines. And I think Stephanie's advice, talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to the people you work with, get involved yourself and get everyone else involved because this is a critically important election. It's not just the ballot itself. There are also going to be tons of democracy related things, at least in Arizona and in other states, on the ballot. About voter ID, about access to the ballot, a variety of referenda and initiatives that could either make voting easier or harder. And we need to get people educated and motivated to come out and vote.
Thank you so much, Alex. Before I hand the floor over to George, I want to thank each of you once again for your time, energy, and expertise and lending it all to the Greater Phoenix community and the Greater Phoenix Urban League. So thank you for that. Without any further ado, President George Dean, let's you close this out.
Just a resounding thank you to both Dr. Spalding and to Alex for their participation in this panel tonight. I think that some very valuable information and hopefully some inspiring and motivational information will go out to all of those folks who tune in and listen to this. And if you didn't see it tonight, we're going to have it on YouTube and Facebook so you can see it later on. But this is important. This is one of the most important things that have taken place in my lifetime for certain. And I'm an old head, so I know that same thing is true for many of you out there that are listening and so forth. This is so very important, and things that are important, we take care of. This has to be a priority. This has to be a priority. As Alex said so many times this evening, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. We cannot give up. My dad used to say, give out, but don't give up. You know, you got to keep on keeping on. And that's what we're going to do as far as the Greater Phoenix Urban League is concerned, as well as the other 89 local Urban League affiliates around the country and our National Urban League. We're going to keep the fight going, and we ask you to join us. Together, we make a difference. With that, I would say good night.